GDPR for accountants, part 2 of our free 3-part training series. So what is data anyway, and how do we map it? So welcome back to our 3-part GDPR training series. Thank you so much to everybody who's been in touch after our first video. We've had hundreds of responses to our survey, but then we've also had people getting in touch with us by email and submitting questions directly to us, arising out of our first video. So almost 500 firms in Ireland have already signed up for the free trainings, and that number is literally growing by the minute. Accountants really want to get to the bottom of GDPR. So in our first video, we looked at the introduction to GDPR. We looked at the distinction between data controllers, processors, and joint controllers. And then we looked at the letters of engagement and the privacy notices. Based on the feedback on that, there's huge amounts of conflicting information being given to accountants out there. So if you haven't seen that first video yet, if you see the tabs across the page here, so the tabs across the page, if you go to the part 1 tab, press pause on me here, go to the part 1 tab, go back and look at part 1 first, get your downloads, and then come back to me here in part 2. In part 1, we provided you with template letters of engagement and privacy notices. Now, a number of accountants asked for these in Word format, so we've added them now on the part 1 training page. Look, as I said in session 1, the opportunity in relation to GDPR is a reverse opportunity. In that, this is work, this is hassle, this is more unpaid regulation for accountants. So the opportunity here, it's about getting compliant, it's about getting peace of mind, and it's getting a practical solution in place that does not cost an arm and a leg to acquire and to implement. Look, that's part 1. Check it out if you haven't seen it. Okay, here's the thing. OmniPro are not claiming to be GDPR gurus. There's lots of people out in the market are claiming they are. We're not claiming to be GDPR gurus, but what we are saying is that over the last 15 years, we've continually developed and created the tools, the templates, the guidance, the checklists, and the training to help accountants get things done. Like, we are experts in solving accountants' problems, whatever they may be. And that's what this whole training series is about. We did our survey, you told us what your concerns are, and we're going to give you some free training and templates to help with GDPR. As always, we're here for the accountants. Okay, so I want to give you a legislation update. At 12:45 on the 24th of May 2018, in the Seanad, there was a motion to sign the Data Protection Bill 2018 without debate. Like, seriously, only in Ireland can stuff like this happen. It's not as if GDPR has just jumped out of nowhere and has crept up on everybody. So 12:45, the day before it has to come into legislation, the Seanad proposed, let's just sign the legislation without debating it. Now, I assume it will have passed by the time you watch this video. However, Padraig submitted a question to us about this and the need for local legislation. Well, the whole point of GDPR is to standardise the data protection regimes across the entire EU. And the basic problem was here that the variation between the regimes within the EU prior to GDPR was the fact that data protection was just in the form of a directive which gave individual member states too much flexibility to implement their own laws. So, GDPR, or Regulation EU 2016-679, it is a regulation. And regulations have direct effect in EU member states. So, personal data and personal data regulations will be consistent across all the member states. So technically, Padraig, you are of course right that the EU regulation will come into effect, but the Data Protection Act, and I'm assuming it's an act by now, by the time you watch this video, the Data Protection Act, it's the Irish wraparound, the compulsory EU regulation. There are some options in there, but the core remains the same. So Padraig, I hope that answers your question. The main issue we're hearing back from accountants right now is they're not GDPR experts. They have neither the time nor the inclination to take this legislation and implement it. So as well as this free training, we're also in the background, we're hopefully developing a product that will help like that. You see, you know, like so many things you've faced in recent years, you didn't ask for this, but by God, now you've got to implement it. You know, the guidance is sketchy, so many different opinions. The phone is hopping here this morning. Oh, such and such a person said this. I was at a seminar, they said this. That's really an uncomfortable place for accountants to be. Who do you come to? Who do you listen to? Who do you trust? You do need to take action now, though. You need to take the appropriate steps to implement from this point onwards. Whatever you've done up until now, let's just take where you're right now. Let's move forward progressively, proactively, and compliantly from here. One of the first and most basic questions, though, what is personal data? So, if we look at our Irish legislation, if we look at the Data Protection Bill or the Data Protection Act 2018, it defines in there, Section 69 of the Act defines personal data as personal data is information relating to an identified living individual. So this is your company's, data protection is not in relation to them. It is only in relation to your clients, the identified living individuals. And personal data can be an identified living individual or a living individual who can be identified from the data directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier such as a name, an identification number, location data, or an online identifier, or where one or more factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of the individual. So, at a very basic level, personal data is the likes of name, address, telephone number, email address, PPS number. That's personal data. And anything that contains that personal data relating to identified living individuals. Now, okay, so what's personal data? There's 6 core principles here that we need to be aware of. And actually there's a 7th one, I suppose, really. So the 6 data protection principles, this is what you need to be aware of. This is, now, we've got, well, what is personal data? How are we going to manage it? So how organizations need to manage personal data, the 6 core principles are lawful, fairness and transparency, that there's purpose limitation is the 2nd one, data minimization is the 3rd principle, accuracy is the 4th principle, the 5th principle is storage limitation, and the 6th principle is integrity and confidentiality. So what do those 6 data protection principles practically mean? Well, principle 1 is about lawful, fairness and transparency. What we're talking about here is, from a fairness perspective, that the data controller is open and honest about their identity. And the data controller obtains and handles data in a way that it would be expected to be by the data subject. And that they don't use that data inappropriately. The second part of principle 1 here is the lawfulness piece. That this is about processing and consent. So processing is necessary, but we have to have a lawful basis for processing. So this is where we need to get the consent piece. And the data subject, the individual, always has the ability to withdraw consent. Transparency, how data is held and what happens. You know, and this is where we looked at primarily how you deal with this is, if you go back to the first part of the training series, when we looked at the privacy notice, most of what the privacy notice was about clarifying how data is held, what happens and what goes on. So the first principle is lawful, fairness and transparency. The second principle of data protection is purpose limitation. So the personal data, what this means is purpose limitation means the personal data is collected for specified, explicit and legitimate purposes. So that the data processor or data controller, that they gather the information for explicit and legitimate purposes, and that they clarify what the data will be used for, and that it'll only be processed for what is necessary for that process. And that there should be clear and unambiguous information given about the extent of the processing involved, along with data sharing and application. Now, if you're Facebook, this is a massive problem because all the personal data we contain in Facebook, well, how are they actually using that? Google, LinkedIn. How is that data being used? Well, for accountants, well, for the most part, the limitation of data, we're gathering the data for the purposes of providing the agreed engaged services. And accountants tend not to use personal data for marketing purposes or for other reasons. The only reason you have the personal data in the first place is to do your job. So that's where, back to training session 1, where we look at the letter of engagement in the one hand, and now our privacy notice in the other hand, that covers us off. Principle 3 is about data minimization. So this is where you keep adequate, relevant information, but it's limited to what is necessary for the purposes for which the data has to be processed. So this is, you don't keep excessive data. Now, it's not likely for accountants to end up keeping excessive data, but you'll have to agree there are plenty of times when the client shares just too much with us. There's the data you need, but then perhaps we need to be aware of the possibility we could be put in possession of data that technically we don't need it. That's principle 3, data minimization. So just to reflect on them, the 6 data protection principles, we've looked at principle 1, lawful fairness and transparency, we've looked at principle 2, purpose limitation, and we've looked at principle 3, data minimization. The next principle is accuracy. So when you hold personal data, it's got to be accurate, and where necessary, you keep it up to date. Now, a lot of what accountants hold, it's fixed, name, address, email. But data subjects, they have the right to rectification. And you see, really what you need to do here is you need to have regular processes in place to ensure that you hold correct data. This is where data impact assessments come into place. And we're going to touch on data impact assessments in a couple of minutes in this lesson. Principle 5 is about storage limitation. Now, accountants need to watch this one, right? So the storage limitation principle is that data should be kept in a form which permits identification of data subjects for no longer than is necessary and for the purposes for which the personal data is processed. So think about this. Personal data, it's not just electronic data, it's electronic data and hard copy. Your firm, do you have a policy of archival and data destruction? How long do you have files for clients? How long do you have them? So from a technical perspective, we must keep data for 6 years. And based on a solicitor we've been working with who's an expert in GDPR, you may meet him later in play, he said you should keep it for 7.5 years. So you keep it for 6 years because that's your legal requirement. But then you keep it for an extra year in case you need to defend a claim against you. And that somebody making a claim against you could potentially defer the claim. So that's why you get to 7.5 years. But here's the bottom line on principle 5 and storage limitation. If you no longer need data, you need to get rid of it. What are you doing in your firm? Are you consciously... You see, accountants, most accountancy firms will be complying with the requirements of the previous data protection legislation by default. It's in our nature to keep information confidential and to protect data. But the difficulty now is we need to be, not just by default, we need to have policies and procedures which ensure we comply with GDPR by design and default. You possibly need to look at your data retention. If you don't need it, get it out. Principle 6 is about integrity and confidentiality. And you see, while people may be committing breaches of the other 5 data protection policies, the impact on the data subjects is very, very limited. Here's the difficulty with integrity and confidentiality. If data is not held securely, a breach of confidentiality is de facto evidence that a breach has actually occurred. So what do we need to do here? Data has to be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security of the personal data, including protection against unauthorized or unlawful processing, against accidental loss or destruction. This is where we have to look at our physical data protection. We have to look at our electronic data protection. We have to look at the likes of our servers. We have to look at the likes of our computers. Are they encrypted? What security is in place? And one of the difficulties with the new data protection legislation is that if there is a breach, there's a compulsory reporting requirement. That within 72 hours of a breach having occurred, it must be reported to the Data Protection Commissioner. So those 6 principles, but then there's a 7th principle. So the 7th principle is that data controllers shall be responsible for and be able to demonstrate compliance with the first 6 principles. So this is really where the rubber hits the road. This is why GDPR is an issue. So it's not only that we have to have the principles, we need to be able to demonstrate that we've complied with the first 6 principles. So in part 1 of our training series, we jumped in at the deep end on the hot topic of consent. But now we need to take a step back. And in order to comply with this 7th principle, which requires us to implement the first 6 principles, to be able to demonstrate, we've got to take a look at what data we hold and undertaking either data mapping or a data inventory. So the first step in your GDPR compliance journey is to start with, what data do you hold? This is the foundational building block of your data protection or privacy compliance program. The bottom line here is, you can't protect your data if you don't know it exists, if you don't know where it is, and if you don't know the conditions under which it's kept. We've got to have data protection by design and by default. So while you may have done this by default, the vast majority of accountancy firms that we talk to, data mapping is not something they have consciously done. Data exists all around the office and it's splintered out into everything you hold. Now what we need to do is we need to gather it all together and we need to map it. Now, before we start looking at data inventory or data mapping, what's your outcome in this part of the process? Like, this is like an audit plan. We don't just jump into the audit plan. The whole purpose of the audit plan is that at the end of it, we've set out a roadmap that we've identified the risk areas. So what's your outcome here when you're doing data mapping? Well, the overall objective of data mapping is to identify and address potential privacy issues. Why did I liken this to an audit plan? Oftentimes people go off and they do the audit planning and they document systems and they document controls and they tick all the boxes. They tick all the boxes, but they get to the end of the plan and it's kind of meaningless. So like an audit plan, the overall objective in doing your data mapping is to identify and address possible privacy issues. So take time as you go through this process and always think about the potential issues and risks at each stage. Okay, so there's 4 elements here of data flow. The first element of data flow is data items, the information itself. The second element of a data flow is the formats, the state in which the data is stored. Do you have stuff in electronic or hard copy? Do you have stuff on cloud servers, or do you have it on a physical server on a hard drive? So data items, the formats, the transfer methods. So the transfer methods, this is how data items, they move from one location to another, and whether the locations in transport are physical or electronic, it doesn't matter. So how does data move around your organization? And the fourth element of a data flow is the locations. So where are the sites where the data is stored and where processing actually happens? Now, there's two things here, and a number of accountants have asked us about how to do their data mapping, but they've also asked us about the difference between data mapping and data impact assessments. Data mapping is at the very start of your GDPR compliance journey. Data impact assessments come later on. So data mapping is the first stage. And as you identify everywhere where you collect and process data, you gain an overview of where risks may arise to personal data. So when it comes to the point later in your journey where you do a data impact assessment, this will help you focus your attention when you're doing one of those data protection impact assessments. And the reality here is GDPR is not just something for the 25th of May 2018. GDPR is something that is going to be with us and live with us and exist indefinitely into the future. Data protection impact assessments, they're almost like annual compliance reviews. They're like money laundering compliance reviews. They're like investment business compliance reviews. They're like insolvency compliance reviews. Data protection impact assessments, once we've set up our system, once we've got everything up and running, we need to go back and do these data protection impact assessments to ensure that our processes and procedures work, protecting personal data on an ongoing basis. So data mapping is the very first step in the journey. This is where we're saying this is what we have. We're capturing our four elements of our data flow. Data impact assessments is where we come back and do a review. So how do we map data? Well, very, very simple here. There's about 6 steps to mapping data. Questions, 6 questions. So the first question is, well, how is the data collected? The second question is, who is accountable for the data? The third question is, where is the personal data stored? The fourth question is, who has access to the personal data? The fifth is, the personal data shared or disclosed with anyone else? And the sixth, does the system share data with other systems? So, before we go any further, to accompany this training video, we have created 2 documents for you. The first document we have created is your data mapping template. So this is basically a blank Excel spreadsheet. In theory, what we should do is, every firm is different, every firm has different clients, different procedures, that we should sit down, ask ourselves those questions, and we've given you a template to help you do a data map. Now, let's just take a look at this for a second. So we've created an Excel spreadsheet, okay? So the Excel spreadsheet, we've clarified here what personal data is, and we've got a legend here where, personal data is shared with the entity, personal data is shared with the entity that's located outside the European Economic Area. You see, there's different rules here if the entity is outside the European Economic Area. We've identified where there's special categories of data, and we've identified where you've got personal data relating to children. You need to be careful with your personal data relating to children. Accountants are going to encounter that because we sometimes have data of the children of our clients. Our basic letter of engagement covered off a paragraph introducing GDPR and had a privacy notice, but we need to get explicit consent to where you're holding child data. So watch that. So what does this look like? Well, let's just go in here to this. Let's go in here to this tab. So this is about an audit exempt engagement. So you see here across the top, we've identified, well, what's the personal data? How have we obtained it? How is the data retained? Is it on a hard copy file or is it on a server? And who is the information shared with? So we've got our cloud providers, our email providers, our payroll providers. So we've got all these people that it potentially may be shared with. So we're saying here this is an audit exempt engagement. Okay, so from an acceptance continuance perspective, what type of personal data may we have? So name, address, telephone number. For directors and those charged with governance, we may have email addresses, we could have personal bank details, we could have PPS numbers, and we may have given them an option in terms of communication preferences with us. Shareholders in companies, employees in companies. If we have information of children who are involved in these companies. Know your clients from a money laundering perspective. Driver's licenses, passports, utility bills, personal bank statements, government ID cards, all containing personal data. Previous auditors. So if we've got professional clearance, we may have details in there. And then we have the engagement itself, where personal data potentially arises, within the individual engagements. So the idea here is that you would identify, based on your various service types, based on the various elements of your business, what type of data is held. So we have here for an audit engagement, an audit exempt engagement, an unincorporated set of accounts prep, corporation tax, personal tax, bookkeeping, payroll services. We also have for you, an important one to watch is your employee data. So where you hold data in relation to your own employees. Previously there was presumed consent because you needed the data to process the payroll. Now it's a slightly different situation. So so this is the template that you need to fill out. Now, you should know us well enough at this stage. We wouldn't just give you a blank template. So what we've actually done is, there's two documents. So there's two documents. The first document is a template. Okay, so I'm having some technical issues here getting up the second document. But the second document is where we've pre-populated it. Now, obviously, we need to be careful here, and that's why we have a disclaimer on it, because technically firms are different, everything is different, everything is unique. But what we've tried to do here is we've tried to think of your typical generic firm, and we've given you a starting point. We've given you a visual of, well, this is what this would look like if it was completed. So, if you haven't already done so, make sure and download your data mapping template, the blank one, and download your done-for-you data mapping document. You see, it's great being here on video with me, and it's great, you know, I'm giving you stuff, I'm giving you information. But like doing this stuff, it needs to be quick, it needs to be easy. Like you possibly, if you can, you want to delegate this down to a team member. Unfortunately though, like in part one of the training series, we looked at consent and privacy. Now we've looked at data mapping, but it's actually still only the start of the process. You see, you need your full suite of policies, procedures, and you need a clear plan and a pathway to implement exactly what you need to do. So, in the third part of our free training series, we're going to give you our GDPR implementation blueprint, which will set out all the practical steps you need to take to get this done. So I think that training is probably going to land in your inbox on Tuesday the 29th, so keep an eye out for that video. Now, if you haven't already completed the survey, please do. We want to know what your issues are and what your challenges are so we can help. So if you haven't already completed the survey, I think the link is over here to the side. Or alternatively, just go to the bottom of the page and we have a comment box. And as you can see, a few accountants have already been in and have asked some questions. So leave me a comment. Let me know what you're thinking. Let me know what your issue is. I always want to know what accountants are thinking, because when I know what accountants are thinking and what their problems are, that's how OmniPro helps. Look, you didn't ask for GDPR. Nobody's going to pay you to implement it. Do you really have the time or the energy to plow through this legislation and create the templates and the documents to put it in place? We want to help you with that. And we want to minimize the time you spend and the cost you incur doing it, getting peace of mind in relation to GDPR. So let us help you with this. So as I said, keep an eye out for the third part of our training series. That gives you the blueprint in terms of what you need to do and the steps you need to take to implement. Leave a comment below. Let me know how you see this and how you feel about it. If you have friends or colleagues who you think may benefit from this, just shoot them on the email and they'll be able to click the link and they'll be able to access. So until the next time, let's get it done.